Y'all enjoy the symposium. Good luck with your book release. Thank you. That's very interesting.
I would like to introduce you to a wonderful gentleman who agreed to be our luncheon speaker. Michael Strutt has been at Parks and Wildlife probably for about 8 years. He has tremendous responsibilities. He is actually in charge of the cultural resources for Parks and Wildlife for the entire state of Texas. I have no idea how many parks Michael manages. I think he must spend probably 100,000 air miles and road miles every year. It's an awesome task. So I'd like to bring our friend, Michael Strutt, to the podium now, and it's all yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the Conservancy, Jan and Jeff and everybody for having me here today. And it's especially gratifying to be able to follow my friend, Kristen McMasters. Kristen and I have known each other for about 20 years. And I'm not sure that she knows this about me, but I am one of the direct reasons of her having her job. I was the archaeological supervisor at Manassas Battlefield when as they were calling it, the third battle of Manassas happened. And the Stewart's Tract came into federal holding because of the controversy surrounding what was going to happen there. The previous year, the Wheeler Tract and the Bronner Farm, which the Bronner Farm, as you heard talking to Okoka earlier today, Bronner Farm was the start of the second Manassas. It's where Jackson's men and their line stood and first fired on the Union, who had no idea Jackson was there. Jackson, everybody knows, was the running ghost. So, Kristen, you're welcome. As Jan said, I'm the Director of Cultural Resources, so my staff and myself is our responsibility for the historic preservation and the archaeology of all of our state parks and the state historic sites, the fisheries. There's also wildlife management areas, which don't fall directly under my purview anymore. They did, but we now have a cultural resource person, although there's only one for 50 wildlife management areas in the wildlife division. And it sort of sounds silly, but there is a firewall between the divisions of state parks and wildlife. But we do cross that line sometimes and go help him work in the wildlife areas. This is how we currently have the state divided up for myself and my staff. If you can't hear me, let me know. I'm going to move this thing up a little bit. We have 6 regions, and you can see the size of the regions that these folks have to travel. They each have 19 or 20-some parks amongst them that they have to take care of as archaeologists. I've got 6 field archaeologists stationed out in the regions from Davis Mountain State Park to Rockport. The archaeologist for this region, she is officed out of Sheldon State Park. The program, we oversee, as I said, all of the preservation and cultural activities for the state park system. And what do? Well, we survey for archaeological sites prior to development. New park is going to come online. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Before it becomes a park, it's just raw land or has been a former ranch. So all the development that's going to happen has to have archaeological and historic preservation clearance. We do some large-scale survey prior to the acquisition or sale of land. We've done a fair amount of that in the last several years at Palo Duro Canyon State Park. I'll show you some pictures of that. But Jan mentioned it's a pretty big job. We've got 3,000 recorded archaeological sites so far, and we've surveyed only 23% archaeologically of the 600,000 acres that are in the state park system. There are 97 parks and state historic sites. San Jacinto is a state historic site, capital S, capital H, capital S. We tend to call it a park. It is not a park. It is not a recreation area. It is a state historic site. We're in a park system. One of the problems that we have is because we are a public entity, people want to treat it and have for decades, nearly a century, want to treat it as a recreation area. And we do have that issue that we have to sort of back that off, keep pushing back on people wanting to do recreation. That's what Sheldon Lake is for. That's what Brazos Bend is for. That's what Village Creek is for. San Jacinto is a state historic site. We have to fight that. We do project-oriented research. We do conservation of our historic and prehistoric archaeological sites and the objects. Preservation, maintenance, and repair of our historic buildings and the features. I'll show you a little bit of that. Until recently, I had a historic preservation specialist on staff. We assist the parks themselves because we are stationed out. We are consultants to the park superintendents. They run the parks on a daily basis. They bring in the revenue, the income, and we help them with their historic questions. And we assist third-party projects on state parks. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. We do that through a local facility in Austin, which is where I am based, in the headquarters building. I don't know if you've ever seen our headquarters in Austin. It's a building of, I don't know, 600 or 700 people in that building. We all live in one of those little puzzle palaces. You know, everybody's got a cube. So I manage all of that out of, a 12 square foot area. But we have this, Texas, and I got 12 square feet. But we do have this lab and library where oral histories are, where the historic sites branch records are when we brought these sites into the state inventory. You know, all of the deeds and all that kind of stuff is there. We do research support. We have an archaeology lab team there. They are mostly part-time, graduate student kind of thing, so that group is constantly rolling over. We do have a full-time survey team. They're the folks who do the large-scale stuff. What they get for us is the interpretive data for places like San Jacinto to be able to tell the story of that place, whether it's a state historic site or a recreation park. There is a history there to it. And what our survey team does is get that history out of the ground and give the park staffs the information to interpret. We don't do the interpretation, the park staffs do that. But we get that information for them. And this motley looking bunch with me standing head and shoulders above the rest of them is my staff. That doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I'm taller than all of them, but appropriately enough, we are at Alamo Plaza here. Because of budget cuts and a few other things, several of these faces are no longer with us, unfortunately. I was asked to talk about the challenges to Texas State Parks and to my program in particular. The challenges are in some ways large, in other ways they're minute details that we have to deal with being a state entity. $4.6 million shortfall for the biennium for FY11 and 12. Part of that is due to the fact that as opposed to many other state agencies where they get their appropriation from the state government, here's your dollars, your bottom line, simply work up to that as your year goes on. We get half from the state. The rest of it is revenue that we have to bring in. So it's gate receipts and t-shirt sales that bring in literally half of how your state park system and state historic site system runs. So we have to manage our budget a lot closer than any other state entity because as our revenue stream stops at a certain part in the year, we have to make sure our spending stays even with that. We have to prognosticate out where our money is coming in or not, and when, and how we can spend that. So that's how we got to this $4.6 million shortfall over the biennium. We also had mandated cuts over the last legislative session. We're in a recession. Everybody in the state's hurting. So my program was actually slated to lose 25% of our personnel and up to 50% of our funding. Through various mechanisms, that's changed. I ended up losing 2 positions. One of them, fortunately, somebody had moved on, and I held that position out knowing that this was coming. But unfortunately, I did have to let somebody go this past year because I was told to lose 2 positions because we were closing 2 of our regional offices. That map I showed you, the very first picture, 6 regional offices. We had 8. So we closed 2 offices, and a number of our colleagues are no longer with us. There are further budget cuts possible in FY13. The legislature has told us that if you read the papers and anything, that's potential. At the same time, we have two new properties coming online, one at Devils River and one at Palo Pinto, what we're calling it's in Palo Pinto County. We're now tentatively calling it Palo Pinto Mountains State Park. No money has come with Palo Pinto Mountains. Devils River came completely funded, interestingly enough. There are private donations. We got 18,000 acres, and I'll show you a picture of it in a little bit. Gorgeous slice of West Texas heaven. It's a beautiful, beautiful property, and it came with some dollars. So we, my staff and I, have to help plan that park, look for the archaeological resources, look for the historic resources that are out there. Then last year, as you all know, if you're living anywhere in and around Texas, you've fought that drought. And because of that drought, 1 year ago right now, the Rock House fire started in the Big Bend region that eventually burned 314,000 acres. It burned 25% of Davis Mountain State Park. The Possum Kingdom fire had happened in April last year as well. That burned 97,000 acres or something like that. And it burned over 82% of Possum Kingdom State Park. And then the Bastrop Complex fire, which was 37 or 38,000 acres, and that was a 97% burn over Bastrop State Park. And Bastrop, like San Jacinto, is a National Historic Landmark Park because of its intact National Park Service designed Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, built park landscape. And I'll show you a little bit about that at the end of this lecture. I was asked to talk about a number of different things, and so I'm venturing out and away from San Jacinto, but I will come back to it. This was one of the reasons that we have that budget shortfall. This is Lake Somerville last year. This is August 10, 2011, Lake Somerville. People stayed away in droves, That's not much to fish on or recreate on. So that's one of the reasons why our revenues were way, way down last year. So we restricted a number of park hours in some of our operations, our summer hiring. We restricted a lot of that to be able to stay within budget because people were not coming to the parks and the historic sites. I mentioned third-party projects. This is one of them. This is Village Creek State Park. One of the things that my staff has to do is they don't go do the archaeology, but ahead of any of these third-party projects that come on the parks or the sites, they manage the archaeology that has to get done ahead of that. They'll hire a firm to go and do the archaeology. My folks make sure that it gets done properly. This was a gas well at Village Creek. Obviously, it blew its top. And when it did, it went from a few hundred square foot sized pad to about an 8-acre disaster area that was all bulldozed. All the trees were burned out. As soon as that thing popped its lid, you had the forest catch on fire. So now you've got a forest fire situation. They had to go in and bulldoze a perimeter around it. Well, that disturbs an awful lot of ground. So these are the kinds of things that my staff deal with that are totally outside of our control. Parks and Wildlife does not own the mineral rights under any of the parks. Somebody else does. So people come in and say, we've got the right. You have to give us access. So we control where the access goes, and it's generally a negotiation of, we want a tank battery of 10 tanks. How about we give you 2 and we put them over in the corner of the park instead of next to the campground, that kind of thing. So let's talk a little bit about projects. Instead of challenges, let's talk a little bit about some of the fun stuff that we do get to do. This is Big Bend Ranch State Park out in the Big Bend, and it is toe-to-toe with Big Bend National Park. For those of you who like to go out to the national park, especially, I was talking with a young man yesterday. He said, I was out there in Big Bend, and it was great. Gosh, all kinds of people. And I said, did you go to the state park? He said, no, I went to the national park. I said, go to the state park next time. 314,000 acres of Chihuahuan desert, mountain, and wilderness, and doesn't get that much visitation. It's gorgeous. If you want to go get lost, this is the place to do it. But out there, there is a lot of archaeological sites. There's, so far we've got, I think, 400 and some odd recorded archaeological sites on the property, and all we're doing is looking at slivers. We're looking at trail areas where former ranch roads and things like that have gone in, and where we're going to be putting the visitation. So we want to make sure there's no archaeological sites that'll get damaged or looted along the way. But we also have things like this. This is a complex. This is a former ranch complex on a stage stop. There was everything you can think of that would have supported a farm out in the desert. There was an orange grove. There is a garden. You can see there's a wall down here. They had all kinds of barns and things out there. This is adobe construction. It's just sitting out there melting into the ground. What do you do with this kind of stuff? It's a ruin when we get it. So the best we can do is record it and try and slow the decay down, but at least record it to some level. But because we're running a trail right through near here, and you can see we got our Suburban down there, and I can tell you stories about that Suburban getting stuck in so many different places. We also have to make these kind of places safe, because the visitor's going to come, they're going to want to go play around that building, and where the chimney fall is, I almost broke my ankle walking over that stuff. So if you can imagine somebody just walking up there, walking around, it easily twist an ankle. We've got to try and make these places safe. So these are the kind of things that my staff do. If you notice the date stamp on there, it's February of 2010. I can tell you from personal experience, though this is the desert, it gets real cold in the desert in February. This is just one of my favorite shots of the Big Bend area. It's a large landscape. And when you've only got 4 people doing archaeological survey, it takes a long time to get anywhere, to do anything. Some of the places that we get to, we take trucks in. By the way, it's an hour from pavement until you hit park headquarters. That's all on dirt road. From there, we take other dirt roads, and we're taking that big Suburban, and that'll only get us so far. We'll trailer behind it an ATV, and there are times where the ATV won't get us there. So we go to horse or mule to get us to the places that we want to go. And why are we going there? Because there's archaeology out there. It's sort of out in the middle of nowhere, but backpackers will be going there. We're going to be setting backcountry camps, that kind of thing out there. So we go and do the archaeology ahead of that. But there's also opportunities. I mean, this is a gorgeous place. And as you can see from my tent sitting there, I have had the opportunity, and I consider myself incredibly lucky to be able to go and do these kinds of things on our state parks. Gotten to camp out there a number of times. That's why I know it gets cold in the desert in the wintertime. But when you wake up to scenery like this, and you go to bed with scenery like that, you're willing to put up with cold toes for a little while. But it also gets hot out there. And as you can see in this picture, again, the large landscapes that we're dealing with. Behind me, you wouldn't notice it from this picture, but this was a ranch complex. I'm standing in the middle of a pasture, and there was the whole cattle chutes and everything out there. So we've got to record all of these things. Some of that stuff we're going to be taking down because those old fences, they're all rusted and falling over, that kind of thing. So they're really safety hazards. So we record and take them down. This was a pretty hot week in June, and this was a really, really hot week in July. It literally melted the soles off of my boots. It was 117 this day. Somebody had one of those little thermometers with them. We were laying in new trail, and both of my boots melted. I walked the last half mile without any sole. I had to turn around and go back because my boots were literally coming off. I fortunately was not all the way down in the canyon that we were going to. So that's a bit of a challenge to walk without your soles. Other challenges for us as a program is because we are open to the public, people with nefarious ideas will come onto public land and do damage to the archaeological sites. This is my far west archaeologist examining a looter's hole in a dry cave at Devil's River State Natural Area. You can see from the size of the hole that they were in there for a little while and dug a number of things up. He found bone and he found other artifacts and things. This kind of stuff is not common, but we have a number of cases every year where our park staffs will find this kind of thing. At San Jacinto this past year, 2 gentlemen were found and fined carrying metal detectors, having been out on the property metal detecting. This is another dry cave at the Devil's River property. This gentleman that's wearing the hat is the law enforcement officer for that property. At 2 o'clock in the morning, this guy's got a lot of guts. He saw a campfire in this cave. And it's a high climb up a cliff, and in the last 10 feet of it, he and I climbed it together, our hand over fist. He had seen 2 gentlemen come, make camp, but they made a fake camp, and he couldn't find them as the sun was going down. He had seen their camp where he was just checking on them, and it bothered him through that night. He got up in the middle of the night to go and try and find these guys to see, were they okay? Did they make it back to their tent? They were not at their tents. But he could see a mile off that there was a fire in this cave, and he realized something was probably not right. Why would you make a camp and then not stay there? They were looting inside this cave. This gentleman, his name, by the way, is Kerr Wardlaw. How's that for a West Texas lawman's name, huh? Our standard issue for these guys, I think, is a 9mm Beretta. He carries with him a Colt 45 bone handle that his father gave him on his 18th birthday. My kind of guy. Other kinds of things that we've been dealing with, and one of the reasons we have some financial constraints is this is the visitor center at Galveston. For those of you who live in this area, you remember a small event, little tiny storm named Ike. 105-mile-an-hour winds and a 6-foot storm surge blew its way right through that visitor center building. This is the interpretive center. You can see here, interestingly enough, that on the back side of the island, now the island, this part of the island where the state park is, was covered in water. There, essentially for several hours during the storm, there was no island. It was all underwater. This side, unfortunately, only had about 4 feet of water as opposed to the 6 or 8 feet of water on the beach side. And we can tell that by the fact that on this shelf, these items, these skulls and the sign are still sitting there. So the water didn't get up that high. And you can see the mark on the wall there. I'm glad I wasn't the person who had to empty the water into the messy stuff out of that file cabinet in the corner, though. All those files, it would have been nasty. This was what the beach looked like after the storm. The stuff here at the bottom is the boardwalk, what's left of it. That 3-part building, we had just built 3 of those, 3 new 3-month-old bathhouses on the beach. And they were all destroyed. One of them had one of the walls blown completely out. There was no rear wall to it. And as you can see, they were put together in sections. So that's one of the issues that we've been dealing with. Now, we did get an appropriation specifically for that park, but this is, taking our time and money and effort to going into that as well. You heard earlier Kristen say about loving parks to death. Well, this was Abilene State Park a couple years ago. So much use around the CCC picnic tables that erosion has been a major problem there. And so we've been doing things to help stabilize some of these features. These are going on 80 years old. They were built specifically to be for the park, but they are all in their own way historic. Here's another set at Lake Brownwood State Park. These were not being loved to death, they were being abused. The entire top course of stone on both of these benches were being knocked off. Now, this isn't something, because these stones are this big, this isn't something that somebody just sits on it and it falls off. They're being purposefully knocked off. So this whole set, my historic preservation specialist worked with our historic mason to have this set of picnic table put back into use, and Lake Brownwood's got a number of those we've had fixed up over the last couple of years because they take a lot of use and abuse. This is Port Isabel Light. The handrail up at the top, this is open to the public. It is a state historic site. We don't run it. It is run by the Chamber of Commerce in Port Isabel, but it's financially our responsibility. We have realized in the last couple of years that the metal up top, it's in a salt environment, is suffering from decay and rust, and so we're going to have to redo that upper platform, and that's going to be a fairly expensive undertaking, and we don't want to have to close the light to do it, but it's probably going to have to happen in the next year or so because it will become a safety issue. You can see it, this was before we put a coat of paint on it a few years ago. The paint has to come from Germany because it is a special paint. We apparently don't make it here in the United States that can withstand the kind of weather that you get in these marine environments. As I mentioned, I had a historic preservation specialist on the Cultural Resources staff. He retired this year, and I asked when would I get a chance to refill his position. We typically go through a lapse period of 3, 6, sometimes 9 months where we absorb that salary, and that salary gets used somewhere else within the system. And this is standard operating procedure for us, where we lapse salaries. I asked in an email, when can I fill Doug's position? And the response came back, don't think about it. So, no, it was sort of tongue in cheek, but essentially what I was being told was it's going to be a while. So we have one historic architect to handle all of the architecture across the state park system. We had a historic preservation specialist and a historic architect, whereas I've got 6 archaeologists in the field team. We're now down to 1 historic architect. So we've got one man who is running in his sleep trying to keep up with all of the things that need to be done. Some really, really great projects that we have had an opportunity to do over the last 5, 6, 8 years. This is Palo Duro Canyon. You know, we're talking about San Jacinto and a battle and doing archaeology there. Palo Duro is also one of those battle sites that is of incredible importance. It's actually a watershed historic event in American history, and it's really not very well known, and we don't do a very good job at interpreting it. We were there just 2 months ago looking at the interpretation of Palo Duro Canyon, and especially the Battle of Palo Duro. It's important because in 1874, this is 2 years ahead of the battle at the Little Bighorn, the southern bands of the Kiowa, the Comanche, and the Cheyenne were going into winter camp at Palo Duro Canyon, which is their traditional winter campgrounds. And the Army, on a September morning, late September 1874, came off of the canyon walls, came down and attacked the Indians. And because of this battle, there are no Native American tribes left living in Texas. At this battle, those southern bands of those plains tribes were pushed to the reservation in Oklahoma. Their horses were all taken by the Army at the time, and they were driven several miles south to Tule Canyon, and they didn't know what to do with them. They had nearly 1,000 horses, and the order was given, take the ones that are good, keep them, slaughter the rest of them. So there is a canyon, it's now on private property, where those horses were killed, and we have, over the last, starting in 2005, we got the property where we think, and we now know through archaeology, the camp was where the various bands were camping. Palo Duro Canyon, like Big Bend, is a large landscape. And so managing this and doing archaeology and the cultural landscape of it is a bigger challenge and a bigger presentation than San Jacinto. Kristen talked earlier about the Okoko. We didn't do it in a technical way at Palo Duro, but this was a running battle of over 9 miles. So when the Army poured down off of the canyon top to attack the tribes down below, the men fought a rearguard action. The women and children and older people ran up the canyon, And the men simply held off the Army by getting behind boulders and firing at the Army as they tried to press forward. And it was a running battle of over 9 miles. And the reason we didn't own it, even though Palo Duro Canyon is a pretty good-sized state park as state parks go, was we didn't get this property until 2005. We didn't get what we think is the final piece in the battle until last year. So it presents a different kind of challenge from a landscape perspective, from an archaeological perspective, from a cultural perspective. And as you can see, it's also an incredibly gorgeous spot. So getting an opportunity to go do work out there has been really, really a lot of fun. But while we're looking for a historic battle from 1874, we're also finding things like this. I was supervising a couple of volunteers, and I was trying to keep them out in front of me in a straight line, which is very difficult to do in that wilderness setting. When I hear one of the guys let out a whoop, and I was like, oh, man, he must have found something really, a 45-70 shell or something like that. No, he found, this is one of the most beautiful lanceolate points I've ever seen. This is from the late Archaic period, a couple thousand years old. It's made of local Tacova jasper that comes out of the canyon itself. So we're finding the prehistory as well as the history out there while we were doing this survey. And again, we have to look at this landscape and think, where would you have hidden to fire at the Army as they were coming at you? Or conversely, if you were one of the soldiers, where would you have knelt to fire back? So we're looking around under boulders, climbing up on top of promontories, and so it's not, we can't do the archaeology there like is being done at San Jacinto, where you lay out a grid and you spend the time. This is covering a large area with a few people. But we did find the camp. And so you can see metal points on the right there, and some evidence of day-to-day living that the Native Americans had. So now we have that information, and we're able to, I'm hoping that we can do a much better job at the interpretation of it, because as I said, this is really a watershed event. This is the equal to the Little Bighorn. And although that was a loss for the whites, this was a loss for the Native Americans, and they no longer live in Texas because of this event. That was Palo Duro Canyon up near Amarillo, so let's travel south now down toward the Rio Grande, just east of the Big Bend area at Seminole Canyon State Historic Site and Park. It is known for its rock art. This is Lower Pecos style rock art dating from approximately 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. There's also evidence on top of the canyon. Now that rock art is in rock shelters down inside the canyon, but on top of the canyon, there are archaeological sites, some of which we didn't know about. The knowledge of that area is there's nothing up on top. There's no reason for them to be up on top. All the resources, the water, the animals, everything is down below. That's where the shelters are. That's where the occupation is. We had an archaeological survey done. We're planning on putting in some park infrastructure. This is one of those state historic sites that has camping on it because it's a pretty large parcel of property. Lo and behold, in the start of the construction project, here is an archaeological site. It's not a very big one, but it turned out to have a fair amount of stuff in it. So in an emergency procedure, my entire staff, we went out to Seminole Canyon for several weeks a couple years ago to do this excavation. And what we found is what are called burned rock middens or rock hearth features, where a fire is started, rocks are put on top of it, more fire on top of it, the rocks are heated, they get superheated, and then you take desert succulents, soltol and things like that, you wrap them in leaves, you put it on top of those rocks, throw some soil and some more hot rocks on it, some more soil, and over 3 days of steaming, the sugars come up out of the soltol and the other cactus, and it becomes edible. Otherwise, the stuff is I'm told, pretty nasty, and I've also been told that once it's cooked, it's still pretty nasty, but it was edible and also nutritious. So this was the kind of thing that not on our radar screen, nothing that I had planned in the budget, nothing that I had planned in time, but it was, guess what, guys, this has got to get done. So here's 2 to 3 weeks out of our schedule, we're going to go do this project. Now I've got a permit. Somebody's got to write this up, so my West Texas archaeologist has been writing this up. But we do this work so that we can interpret it to the public. I mean, there's no sense getting this stuff out of the ground, and one of my big initiatives with my staff is, if you're going to do the work, get the information to the sites so that it can be interpreted. And I will admit that we are not doing a great job at that at San Jacinto, partly because what's happening there is incredibly piecemeal. The work has been very particularistic, and we haven't gotten very far at San Jacinto. We need to do a lot more work there. But here, we were able to get one small site excavated. This drawing on the left shows what it would have looked like while it was being used. And then the park staff created their own earth oven, as you can see there on the right, and interpret that to the general public. They take tours out to school groups, and they explain prehistoric living. Waco Tank State Historic Site and Park out in El Paso. So we're covering the state in our tour here. We're now out far west, almost New Mexico. This is also a site known for its rock art. Unfortunately, before it came into, well, it's actually gone in and out of state hands, and at one period in the 70s and 80s when it was out of state hands, it was a local park, and it had a lot of what we now call gang tagging, where people spray painted their name and their gang tags over top of 4,000-year-old rock art. So how to get that off of the ancient art? We looked high and low for a way to get this done. We've had conservators look at it. We finally found a conservator out of Chicago, and this pair here from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who are some of the best conservators in the country, with this gentleman out of Chicago, to look at and study the rock art and the graffiti. What they're doing here is they're using something called portable X-ray diffraction. And we're using a number of different techniques besides that one, but what this study gives us is the constituent elements of the ancient pigments, the ancient binders, what it might have been painted with, the constituent, this is the chemical and elemental constituents of that pigment and the binders, and the rock, the background rock itself, and then the same for the modern graffiti. And the reason we need to know that is we are then using lasers to ablate the modern paints. Now, this particular site, there's no rock art underneath this, but what this gentleman, this is our conservator from Chicago, was able to demonstrate was that he can use these lasers, and by tuning it, knowing what elements are there that you need to get rid of, what elements you want to keep, the laser can set, well, it will actually turn itself off if it recognizes that that is an element we don't want to ablate. And he, as you can see, he's got the controls in his hand. He's also got a pair of glasses on, and this is not just your regular dust mask, because he is ablating modern paints. He's also using a high-energy laser that if you put it to your hand, it'll burn a hole in your hand. So he is using a pair of glasses to protect his eyes. Well, we have to put a similar kind of lens over the camera, because just a laser light diffracting from the procedure will burn the CCD out of a modern digital camera. But we've had the initial study done. We're now looking, we're look into getting grants and look to complete this project. It's, as you might expect, it's not cheap. The laser that he's using is a $250,000 instrument. The other thing that we're doing with this conservator and others is digital enhancement of the rock art out there. On the right is, at natural light, what one of the rock art images looks like. On the left is a digital enhancement of that, and we do it in different hues of the spectrum, and it gives us different looks at the rock art that you can no longer see. It's not visible to the naked eye, but we can put the whole picture together by doing this digital enhancement of the images. So I mentioned Devil's River and Seminole Canyon. This is Seminole Canyon here. The upper yellow area is the first Devil's River property that had the looting that I showed earlier. And this second lower one is the 18,000 acres that we just got this past year. And because of various political pushes and what have you, we're being told you need to get that property open in the next year or so. So planning for that one has been going lickety-split. And my survey team has been on that property every month for a period of 10 days to 3 weeks since last March until this past fall when the fires happened. I'll talk about that in just a second. So this is the Rio Grande and the state border, Lake Amistad. Down here is Del Rio to give you a little bearing on where we are, which is across from Ciudad Acuña. Interestingly, Google doesn't put Del Rio on there, it put Acuña on there. And next to that is Laughlin Air Force Base. This is the Devil's River itself. This is the edge of that property. We have 10 miles of riverfront. When I took this picture, I was standing 175, 200 feet above the river, but look at that water. It is crystal clear. It's about 4 to 6 feet deep in most places. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous piece of property. There is a lot of archaeology out there as well. We will be running an archaeological field school out there this summer with the Texas Archaeological Society. I'm sorry, Jan, I'm realizing I'm going over. I'm almost done. Jim, wherever you are, I know you're sweating. We're going to have 200 to 300 people out on this property for a week, and it's what I'm calling right now controlled chaos to put that many people on 18,000 acres and do archaeological survey. Taking that picture, this is what's behind me, is that Lower Pecos style rock art, so we're going to be looking for more of that as well. So let's get to San Jacinto. Prairie? No, that's not prairie. Invasive species have taken over the grounds at what is now the state property. We had this shredded, this was Chinese tallow. We had this shredded a couple years ago. You heard earlier that we're embarking on 110 acres. We've already started an area up next to the reflecting pond. We want to return it so that it looks a little more like this. I don't know if those are actually endemic grass species or not, but it would look more like this than what it has looked like over the last several years. That's one of the problems of this site, is that it's supposed to be prairie. We want it to look like prairie so that we can interpret that rather than the brambles and the briars that are there. You would think that would be easy enough to do, but the invasives come in, and how did the prairie maintain itself through the eons? Well, fire was. We're talking about doing controlled burn fire out here, but this is a really touchy place to try and do controlled burns, because if it gets away from you, Katie, bar the door. Matter of fact, Katie, close the door and get running. The marsh restoration, since 1993, we've been doing restoration on those marshes. First studying and then actually replanted in 1998. 390,000 cubic yards of dredge spoil were put in to recreate some of these marshes again in 2002. Opened up the Marsh Trail, 2003, another 75,000 cubic yards, added 10 new acres of wetlands. Then in 2004, 6,000 feet of shoreline were restored. Because of the subsidence you heard about earlier, we have lost acres and acres of land that's gone underwater. A lot of this work is happening through corporate sponsors and volunteers. Folks are coming out with their kids, planting these marsh grasses and the trees. We're a public entity. We do get state funding and grant fund to do a lot of this work on a professional level, but we also work with our constituents and the local business community, and they help us out quite a bit. Other challenges, the battleship you heard about earlier, it's literally going to take 3 times the amount of money that we currently have to do the battleship right. $25 million is what the state appropriated for it, another $4 million from the Battleship Texas Foundation. Where will we put it? Where will it go? One of the problems is, as you can see from this picture, this is almost as down low in the ship as you can get. Right below where I was taking this picture is a little hatch, and you're below water line at this point. This is one of the ribs of the ship. She's over 100 years old, and it's sat for 60-some years now, not moving. It went into dry dock once in the late 80s after Parks and Wildlife got it. It had been in a private entity for a number of years. And it's in serious need. The question now is, can it actually be towed out of her slip and put somewhere else. This is all being studied. If you're interested, these are 4 of the potential options for what to do with the ship. The 5th one you saw in Jeff's presentation earlier. We're still studying that one, whether or not any of this is going to work. That's still the question, is what we have financially, what we could potentially do to it, how much harm will we do to the ship through any one of these things without doing an amount of work, repair to the ship first. Thank God we didn't end up with this. This would have been a real challenge. This is the Houston Post, 1945. This was what the plan was when the ship was first being proposed to come to Texas. Let me finish up with one of the things that we've had to work on the last couple of years. I mentioned the fires. This is a map of the burn intensity of the Bastrop County Complex fire. The white line is Bastrop State Park, and again, as I said, this is a National Historic Landmark Park for its landscape and the CCC designed buildings there. The caption to this photograph was 5 a.m. Bastrop parking lot, bathhouse, and refectory. This is what our guys were up against. When our fire teams went into Bastrop, because this fire burned so many private homes, I forget how many hundreds of homes were lost here, our fire teams were essentially by themselves. The federal and other state entities that were out there fighting the fire were trying to protect private property. And they essentially said, guys, we're sorry, you're on your own. With the exception of, there were a couple of air dumps that were made, but a lot of the air dumps were also taking water out of Lake Mina, which is on the park, and dumping them on private homes. We understood that, we knew that. Our guys were out there with 350-gallon trucks, 30-gallon ATV sprayers. You know, a typical truck comes in with 1,200 or 1,500 gallons. So our guys are out there fighting these fires, 200-foot wall of flame come at them, and it broke through their fire lines several times. Yet they made a determined stand at the CCC buildings. This is what an intense fire looks like afterwards. This is a week after the fire. I was on the park. Nothing living. Those trees are dead. A lot of those trees had to come down. So in order to open this park, to open up those trails, we had to do archaeology ahead of where this was, and it exposed a lot of archaeological sites that we didn't know were there. Fortunately, we didn't lose these buildings. This is the day after that picture was taken. You can see how close the fire came to the refectory. This is the 1936 refectory at Bastrop. Firemen told me that it was dropping cinders the size of dinner plates on this building. And the first guy to get there, when their fire line cracked and everybody was falling back, he got there with his ATV sprayer. He's got 30 gallons to protect this building. He said it's a miracle, but we kept this building and the rest of the complex intact. The governor and the Texas Historical Commission give an award for historic preservation every year. And I nominated our fire guys for the Governor's Award for Historic Preservation this year, and they won. So I had the great pleasure last week of being at the Capitol, and these are our fire captains, and they represent more than 100 men and women in Parks and Wildlife who fought those fires. Women too. We have young women out there on the fire line, standing there in the fire as the fire burns around them, protecting those CCC buildings. It was really, really a neat event. The guys brought their kids with them. The governor, being the good politician that he is, brought the kids into the event, had his picture taken with them, and it was really just very heartening to see our guys get recognition for, they essentially put their lives on the line at Bastrop. So now you know, and if anybody ever says, you know, what the heck do they do there at Parks and Wildlife? I've just given you a snippet of what we do in the Cultural Resources Program and the rest of parks. Thanks.